Hello, everyone. This is FIDE Master Viktor Neustroyev. Today we are going to talk about how to realize small material advantage, for example, one pawn or two pawns, or or just two minor pieces versus rook. But this is what I'm going to leave as a homework, and we can talk about it a little bit later, probably next Sunday. Also, I gave you homework for the previous on the previous webinar, and I gave you two positions. One was this, where the question was whether it's possible to take on f7 and white gets advantage there. And the second example was here. No, not here. It was here, where the question was if black can capture on e4. Let me flip the board. By the way, is there anybody who attends this webinar for the first time? If yes, please let me know what's your current ELO is, either on either if you have a FIDE rating or a national rating, or just on chess.com or lichess. By the way, is everything okay with the sound and video quality? Yes, perfect. Thanks, Arush. Looks like you didn't participate in the tournament like you originally wanted, because your father told me that you are going to skip this week webinar because of your tournament. Okay. Okay, let's start. Yes, everything works. First of all, if you remember, there was a homework. So, for example, here, what happens if bishop f7? By the first glance, it looks very attractive. But if you analyze this position, well, look, you can capture on f7, then threaten. Well, if the king goes there or there, then knight e6 traps or wins the queen. However, it's bad. Instead, it's bad. Here the king goes there. And you can still do knight e6, but queen e8, knight c7, and the queen goes to g6, creating problems to your position. For example, if you decide to castle, let's say, they can save the rook. And how many? Two pawns are not enough to compensate the bishop sacrifice. If you decide to take there, then it's queen g2. Rook f1. And, well, here, black is ahead. So this knight is trapped. How this knight is trapped? Okay, let me start with this move. Queen d4 and knight e5 threatening the fork. And if let's say this, well, there is an attack actually. There is bishop h4, so even we don't even really need to trap this knight. This is a dangerous attack, and yes, black is ahead. So that's why this sacrifice, which by the first glance looks promising, is not so promising, and it actually favors black. Well, I don't play it myself, but three 3 or 4 years ago, I played in the tournament, and I wondered why my friend, who was a candidate master at that time, with a rating approximately, well, below 2100. So I asked him, why do you play so? He said that, well, he knows that it doesn't favor white, but against lower rated players, he plays it, which I think is a mistake. So you should play a strong opening against everyone. So maybe you can play the opening where you get a slightly worse position, but then you know what you're doing. Okay, let's continue. This position, knight e4, looks so attractive. You win, you win a pawn, you attack the queen with black pieces, but white has a counterplay. So John first said knight e6. What's wrong with knight e6? Well, the key idea is to open this diagonal and capture on g7. So I think it doesn't work. If you play knight e6, then it's d takes e6. And if you decide to go there, this. And if you continue with this move, it's simply knight d7. And with knight d7, they are able to defend the rook. So you sacrifice your knight in order to take on f8, but you cannot take on f8 because there is a knight. Of course, once you move your queen, then you can win exchange, but it's still not enough. So knight e6 fails. Instead, in this position, there is a better move. Knight e6 and long castle, but you cannot castle long because your queen is under attack. So this, bishop here. Long castle in this position. This is probably what you mean. Mm-hmm. So the goal is to capture there and then capture on f8. Okay, I can play queen c5, I think. Well, let me see if there is a better move. No, I can play queen e5, offering a queen exchange. So you cannot take, because if you take, I take your queen, and then I take there, getting two minor pieces for a rook. Queen e5 is likely to lead to an exchange of the pawns. If you play this move, it's probably knight here. Maybe there is a better move. Anyway, so this is not such a good move. Instead, you'd better leave this pawn where it is and not let the d pawn to move, because while the pawn is on d7, you have advantage in development. How do you get advantage in development in this position? With knight b5, it's almost the same idea, but the pawn on d7 exists. A takes b5, and queen takes g7. How to defend? Well, definitely with this move. Then you attack, and there is no knight d7 move. That's why the only way to defend this rook and avoid checkmate is to play this or that. If queen d6, then, well, we can just take on b7. And then on b5, I mean, and then continue with rook c1. How do they defend? Because if the king goes there to defend the bishop, we capture on f8 for free. Queen c5 looks like a better move because it threatens queen f2. Okay, this is where I want you to think and try to find the best move. Okay, for those of you who joined, we are talking about the homework. And for the homework, I gave you two positions where I asked whether the move, which becomes logical, favors that side or not. So we did cover the first one, the first position. This is the second one. And once we finish, we will go we will continue with the main part of our webinar, which is realization of a small material advantage. So Brian suggests a very nice idea, bishop e3, which attacks the queen and defends f2. It does make sense, but after queen e7, how do you continue? The rook is no longer hanging. You can take there. They probably play f5, or maybe they play d5, or maybe they gain a temper. Then they take here, develop the knight. So where is the compensation? Originally, you are a piece up, and there is a compensation of two pawns. No, there is a compensation of one pawn only. Yes, so bishop a3 doesn't work. f3 works. How does it work? Queen f2 is not a checkmate, and queen f2 is actually completely useless. King d1 and the king cannot be attacked, while white is still threatening with a checkmate. And the best way to move here is to bring the queen back and sacrifice the knight for free. That's why after f3, black usually realizes that they have to make a knight move, but where to move the knight? If they play this move, queen f8 leads to checkmate. Knight f6 is a knight blunder, so the knight is actually trapped. Maybe they take there, you take there, and this is obviously a winning position. You can just take on f8 and realize your material advantage. Or you may not capture it, you may do it later. Okay, so queen d6 maybe is more interesting then, because maybe the knight can go to c5. If so, it can be either b4 or still rook c1. I like b4 idea. Knight goes to b3 to attack the rook, and rook d1. So queen e7 seems to be the only move. And how would you continue in this position? So queen c3 is a double attack, right? You win the game like that. Also, it was a good point. What about queen c5, f3, knight f2, the only square available for the knight? If so, then the queen is overloaded. After b4, where does the queen move? To d6 or e7 in order to defend. If, let's say, you decide to take this and then take there, how do you solve the problem with the rook hanging on f8? So that's why after b4, queen e7, for example, and then you just simply win this knight. Oh, yes, good point. So b4, queen b4, a takes b4. Yes, we just take with our queen because it's on g7. So knight f2 fails too. Knight b5 is the best move here, and white wins. Instead of d5, instead of saving the knight. Okay, let's talk about it. Take this, queen, bishop h6, queen c5, this d5. Okay, yes, it works, but well, I can take there. I can take on d5 actually too. So you take, I take. So here, well, the material is equal, but you remember you always lose here. So for example, knight d7 to try to save, to defend the position. Then rook c1. Queen goes to b6. Let's just move our queen out. Or just bishop e2. Because bishop e2, d takes e4, and we continue with bishop g4, threatening to take. And f5 this time fails. So this, then bishop g5. So if knight f6, queen f8. If rook f6, I still, if then not queen f8, but queen g8, because after this move, it's this. So queen takes h7. I don't think there is a point of capturing this pawn. It's, well, I understand what you want to do. You want to win exchange. Well, it's playable, but bishop g4 seems like a better move. Okay, fine. So what you should remember is that knight e4 is a blunder because of knight b5. And as for this position, don't play like that. Don't play bishop f7 here. So this is a mistake. Okay, so I'm reading your comments on both platforms. We are doing this webinar on Zoom. Those of you who registered received the links to join this Zoom meeting. And we are also doing a stream on YouTube at the Chesslands website, as well as on the Chess World YouTube channel. And later, this stream will be the recording of this webinar will be published on my YouTube channel, and you'll be provided with the link to the recording as well with the homework for the next webinar. So let me close it, and let's continue talking about material advantage, small material advantage. So this is actually a very important skill because well, you can do a tactical strike and win material, but how to win the game finally? And very often, people who have extra material cannot realize it. So let's say they win a pawn and then they don't know what to do. They try to continue the attack, but the attack fails. So you should remember how to technically do this. And sometimes this material advantage is just so small that your opponent gets a lot of chances to draw the game. What you should remember about that is that when you are trying to realize one extra pawn, for example, it does make sense to avoid pawn exchanges, but exchange pieces. Because if you look at this position, let's say, it's a bishop endgame. If only you exchange the bishops, it's completely winning with no problems. And the winning plan is obvious. Like, let's say the bishops are exchanged, you play king e4, you play this, you advance. So you create a pass pawn, chase the enemy king off by means of opposition, invade his camp, advance your pawn, let him take it, but invade his camp on the queen side and capture the pawns. So that's the goal. But with the bishops, the position becomes uh, more complicated. Why? Because there is no opposition. He can just make the bishop moves, and you won't force him to make a king move to let you invade the enemy territory. So uh, prevent pawn exchanges. Instead, exchange other pieces, but that should be equal exchanges. Don't exchange your bishop for the knight if the position doesn't require it. Activate your pieces. Activate your king as well if you think that the king won't be in danger. And of course, use a principle of two weaknesses. Just one small advantage on one side of the board can be not enough. Very often, you can use Zugzwang. Sometimes even mating threats. There are a lot of things to remember to be able to realize material advantage, and today we are going to talk about just some of them. But in the end game, you should understand that your goal is to create a pass pawn and try to promote it, forcing your opponent to sacrifice material for that pawn. So what do you think? How to play for a win in this position? Yeah, so yeah, Brian is absolutely right. Leave enough time to figure out how to win. In other words, leave enough time to come up with a winning plan. So king e4 is logical. Well, does it make sense to play c4? Probably not now. We can play king e4. So let's say they just move the bishop. If they move the king, we can invade their territory with our king. So they just gonna make these moves, and they would avoid bishop exchanges. Uh, what else we know? Well, this is a very good pawn structure because the pawns are located on dark squares, comparing to the black pawn structure where the pawns are on the light squares. And if you can bring the bishop to c8 and at the same time somehow deal with king c7 move, you're likely to win. So, for example, it tells us that this bishop cannot go somewhere because then b7 can be lost. But we also have to deal with king c7 move. However, king c7 move moves the king away from the center and allows us to invade the enemy territory maybe like that, which is good. But after king c7, if the bishop is on c8, they gain a tempo and we have to retreat the bishop. So we have a good bishop, we have a good pawn structure, we have extra pawn. The disadvantage of the black's position is that his pawns are on the light squares. How to continue? Well, king f4, then what? Go there? Well, possible. Yes, you can play that move, but you can do it later. First, white starts with bishop c4. Well, he doesn't know what exactly to play and just try to realize what black opportunities here are. King e3. So he is just making moves in order to provoke black to make a mistake and to understand if black sees a way how to progress. Of course, black doesn't have a way to progress here. They just have to stay and wait. Bishop f7, bishop d3. Well, these moves are completely useless, but replacing the bishop to e4 was positive. Now, king d2, bishop f3, and finally the bishop goes to f1. This is a helpful move. Why? Because it allows to support the pawn on c4 in future. Bishop e6, and now c4 is played. This is supported, this restricts the bishop, and of course we should bring the king. Well, this could be done earlier. Of course, there is no need to play all these useless moves that white actually played. Bishop f1, king goes to c3. Well, that didn't make any sense. Bishop d3 offer in exchange, and the king now goes to the original plan to go to g5. King f6. So this is the white's maximum. They achieved what was seen by naked eye. But how to progress? Oh, let's say they play bishop g4. Bishop f1, bishop f3. Well, we can try this move. Bishop h5. Now we have to decide where to go. What do you think? Okay, Brian likes g7, but Brian, g7 is located on the other side of the board, but looks like the place of action is on the queen side. Or I would say on this part of the board. So king f6 back means that you just repeat the position. Bishop f3, it's a repetition. So king f8. Why king f8 is played? It's actually a very clever move. Why? Because it ties the bishop to this diagonal. Because if, let's say, the bishop moves away, now we can play this move. How does it work? Let's say another check, the king goes to d8. And this time we are going to play bishop h3 and bishop c8. Well, let's say they control this diagonal, and now bishop h3 is not possible. Well, then you at least have this, and you can think about doing this in order to capture the b7 pawn and promote the a pawn. So with the king there, you stop the enemy king to occupy the corner. Okay, pawn to d5 is a nice suggestion. We can talk about this move a little later. Well, in which position do you like pawn to d5? Because okay, so let's say king f8, I play bishop g4, or bishop d1 even, d5 with a pawn. Okay, how does it work? Take, bishop f3. I don't want to take it with my with my king, because then I blunder bishop g2 and lose a pawn. So if bishop c4, this time I'm happy to exchange because the white king is too far. So if you are going to exchange the bishops, you should realize how far your king is. Of course, now you even lose. King b5 and the pawn is promoted. So d5 should be played, but should be played very accurately. What if bishop g2 before d5? Okay, yes, but if you play, let's say king f8, I play bishop d1, and then bishop g2, what if I just attack this pawn? So you have to retreat back or you have to play c5. But c5 means that I can play this move and I don't see the way to progress. Even if you do so, it's just a fortress. Okay, that was also a very nice suggestion. King c7, king d8, and then we can try moving the bishop. No, I don't see in which position. Okay, b5. Well, b5 is interesting, but it seems to be too early. So, for example, if you decide, well, bishop h5, king to f8, and if, let's say, they play bishop d1, you play b5. Yes, it's interesting, but does it work? Oh, well, let's say take, 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 this. And then I want to sacrifice my bishop for that pawn. I'm sure I can do it because this king is again too far. So this, I can defend it, which makes a lot of sense. But let me first try this. Why do I want to play so? Let's say bishop f1. Yeah, let me illustrate it. And then I want to play, well, king b4. Yeah, king b4 is enough. Oh, king b4, I just win a pawn. Well, you can probably take this, but then it's a draw. So b5 fails, but try to remember these moves. You may, well, if the bishop is on g2, then b5 makes more sense, of course. Anyway, how to play? Well, in the game it was king d7, but there was only one way to draw the game. Who can tell me which exact move black should play in order to draw? No, it's not king e6 because king e6 it's a check and bishop c8 and you lose your pawns. Not all three, but at least two. It was bishop g6. How does bishop g6? What's the difference between bishop d1, bishop f3, or some other moves? There is a difference. Now let's say bishop e2, so trying to invade. Well, bishop h3 could make sense, but every time you play this, it's king c7. King e6, no way to progress for the king. Check. And in this position, bishop f5. This time, the exchange of these bishops guarantees a draw because this king is too far. And the pawns are promoted simultaneously. So there is no win. Queen e5, king b3. So the key idea of bishop g6 was to play bishop f5 and exchange. And for a human player, even for a grandmaster, it's so hard to realize. That's the reason why he didn't play bishop g6 and played king d7, which was a serious mistake. And now king d7 loses. Well, once again, what we are trying to achieve, if let's say it's bishop d1, we are going to move our king there, then to d8, locate the bishop on h3 and do this. Or maybe do this and then play c5, chasing the king there, which allows us to attack this with king c7 move. For example, like that, bishop g4, then you can continue with, well, I don't know, maybe c7, c5 already works. Let me play bishop g2, there is no rush. And then, well, they have to make a move. Let it be, I don't know, bishop e6 or what? Just any move. Maybe this, I play c5, king e6, after which I can play king c7 and capture these pawns. It's completely winning position. Once b7 falls, c6 falls automatically. So king d7 was played to not let the white king to invade the enemy camp. But bishop h3. Now, if this move, it's an easy win. How? Bishop e6 and this time d5. Bishop d3, d6. So let's say bishop is there. And how do you win in this position? Who can tell me? c5? Okay, you can play c5, but I think c5 doesn't work. If c5 it becomes a draw, how do you progress after c5? So it's not c5. Yes, thanks Zamfir, it's definitely get the king to b6. Well, yeah, you can do through f7, let's say, but then use duck squares to go to b7 and capture the b7 pawn. This is how there is a win. If you play c5, you block this road. So king d6, bishop h3, king d6, and this allows us to play this move. Well, bishop e2, the attempt to exchange this pawn for this pawn. Well, you may say, what's the purpose of bishop e2? Let's play king c7. But black realized that king c7 loses. Bishop e6. And now if you bring the king back, it's bishop f7, offer an exchange of the bishops. And if this time you exchange, it's completely winning because there is no side maneuver with the king, which allows him to capture our pawns. So this is an easy win. Now the king has to move, and we simply continue with king f6, this, and then we do a passed pawn and win this endgame. If, let's say, king d8, it's the same. You play d5, and then do this maneuver. Well, first maybe d6, and then do this maneuver, because the king cannot move to c7. If he does so, then it's an easy win. So that's why king c7 is not playable. Bishop e2, trying to exchange. King e8, they can capture it, and they actually did it. Well, if this, it's the same, and then d5. That's why they take. And the king goes to d8 first. Not this, because of king c7 move, but king d8 first. Well, king d5, but bishop captures there, king captures there, bishop captures here, and king c3 winning the pawn. It seems like it is a draw, but actually it's not. How do we continue here? Tanish, do you want to say anything? If not, please keep yourself muted because of the background noise. He could have played bishop b6. What do you mean bishop b6? Bishop b5? Yes, he could, but what's the purpose? This. You mean you can play king c4, but it still doesn't help because the white king is able to reach this. And then this king is too far from the a pawn if the bishops are exchanged on a6. Well, almost the same thing happened in the game. King b4, king b6. This is lost. So they played bishop e6, sacrificing that pawn. But even if, let's say, they play bishop d3, it's bishop b7. Bishop c4, bishop a6. And after the exchange, the pawn is easily promoted. So bishop e6 was played in the game. Now what? So what comes to your mind? Should we capture? So b5, what does it mean b5? Bishop b5. No, it fails, of course. You lose after that because they can stop the pawn and they can promote your b pawn. Bishop b7. Yeah, bishop b7 makes more sense because if you take right away, it's king c5. Now what? King b7? Fine. But they can successfully block with bishop c8 move. Look at this nice move. If the king goes to c7, it's bishop a6, and now they fully blockade the pawn, and you cannot do anything. So this king comes closer. If you take, you cannot promote. That's why bishop b7. Keep the king here to shoulder the enemy king and not let him go to c5. Bishop d7, bishop to a6. Okay, so what if white captures? No, it's king c5, bishop b7. What if white captures? Well, this is a draw because how to progress? If a6, the pawn is trapped. If king b8, it's king b5, the pawn is also catched by this king, by the black king. So bishop b7 instead, attacking on a6. Bishop d7, bishop takes a6, and this is winning because we are going to play bishop b7. Well, actually, right now we are going to play this move, then a6. Well, they played this, bishop h3. Then it's bishop b5. Why bishop b5? Because after we play a6, we can play bishop c6 and secure the queen in square. So bishop c8 and bishop c6 in this position. And this is a Zugzwang, because if they move their bishop, we continue with a6, a7, and a8. They cannot control e8 with his bishop. And if they move the king, c4 is the only square, well, not the only, but the only logical square to occupy, then it's bishop b7. And this time, in case of the exchange, the king is too far because the white king is close to the queen, to the a pawn. Okay, maybe they play something else. So not this move, but let's say this move. How do we continue? If so, we can continue with bishop f1 or bishop e2 or bishop d3, doesn't matter, and then threaten to do this. So for example, bishop c2, we can play this move. Now they have to occupy this diagonal. Otherwise, we play bishop g2 and progress with the pawn promotion. So bishop f4, bishop h3, bishop c8, bishop b7, and only then we promote. Okay, let's go back. Let's go back to the original position. Well, by the first glance, it seems like the position with a lot with an extra pawn, and it can be winning, but usually the pawns are separated and we can create a pass pawn on the other side and distract the enemy bishop. But this time we couldn't because the place of action is on one side of the board. And here, before coming up with a winning plan, we should realize what our benefits are and what are the disadvantages of the enemy position. So we have extra pawn, good bishop, and far advanced pawns. They have bad bishop, potentially weak pawns, and that's why we are trying to take advantage of it by improving our bishop, by invading the enemy territory with our king, and by converting C and D to a passed pawn in some variations. Okay, fine. Let's continue. Let's think about a winning plan in this. So, of course, in all in games, when you have extra pawn, you have to come up with a different plan. There can be, well, if you know a lot of plans, like for example, especially if there are only rooks on the board, then some positions are already well known, and well, you can reach a precise position where you know that you're winning. But very often the end game is quite complicated. You have material advantage, and here you have to decide how you can realize it and not allow your opponent to make a mistake. Well, if you don't see a way to win, at least it does make sense to play some moves in order to see what your opponent wants to do. If he, well, very unlikely that he will just stay with his pieces and repeating the position. Most likely he'll try to improve. And maybe this improvement is mistaken and you can already take advantage of it. What do you think about this position? It's definitely better for white. White has extra pawn, but it's 3 versus 1 on the queen side. And there is a bishop. So yeah, it's quite complicated. What do we have to do? And how to deal with the g pawn? Because the g pawn at a certain moment of the game may become a passed pawn. Well, it is a passed pawn, but once it reaches g2, what should we do with it? And it's actually one, two, three, well, four moves. A knight move, maybe there, maybe somewhere else, and three pawn moves. The pawn is already on g2. If we just continue with this, it can be very, very slow. So for example, one, let's say they move the knight, c5, they play g4, c6, g3, c7, and g2, and we have to sacrifice the bishop. So Brian thinks that he should exchange one of these knights. For which piece? Knight for a knight? Yeah, knight for a knight makes sense. I agree. But how to do this? Because if you just play knight d3, well, what if he tries this and brings his king to the center? You can take, he takes. Then his king is not only close to the f pawn, but it's also close to the queen side. And if he can reach b6, I think he can successfully draw the game. So yeah, because this pawn is already far advanced, it does make sense to play knight c6 and threaten the pawn on a7. So they cannot push it. We just take it. What they have to do? Well, there is a passive defense. They could try this, but if they do so, then we can advance the pawns and create a pass pawn really quickly. What else they can do? So here they decided to play knight f2 to gain the tempo and continue with a pawn move to play g2. And once you're playing this move, you should understand that there is a chance to win this pawn, after which you have these three. How to deal with the g pawn? Well, you should admit that at a certain moment of the game, you have to sacrifice the bishop for that pawn on g2. But because the knights are stuck on the king side, and you capture there and advance your three pawns, most likely his knight activity won't be enough to stop these pawns. And this is what you may rely on. Well, you should calculate, of course, but I absolutely understand that it's impossible to calculate the line to the very end. So sacrificing the bishop for that pawn and capturing the rest of the pawns at least guarantees that you won't lose the game, because well, you know that rook and knight versus rook is a drawing position. Well, rook and bishop versus rook is winning, but if there is a knight instead of a bishop, then it's drawing. So if, let's say, you sacrifice the bishop for that pawn and take here, you are left with rook and knight versus rook and two knights. So just exchange of one knight pair allows you to draw, even in case if you lose all these pawns. Well, black should activate their king instead. Knight a7, check. Well, exchanging the rook means that the king goes to that side quickly. So that's why keeping the rooks is recommended. But after knight f2, at least there is an exchange. So probably rook f1, then this knight captures, then c captures, rook d3, king c2, but then the rook moves. And I don't think it's winning. So you can at least play rook d8. And the king is closer to the queen side. King f6 made a lot of sense, but this move is not so obvious. Instead, black played this, rook e1, and they played g4. Well, maybe I would play the same, because this plan seems to be very transparent, and after this, black gonna have material advantage. b4, so it's too early to capture on a7. Let's advance the pawns. g3, b5, and if g2 is played, then bishop g2 works. How does bishop g2 work? So knight takes, and you can play rook g1. So it's not a loss. Even if they do this move, knight e3, king d3, there is a pin, and there is no way to play this move because the other knight is hanging too. So this time g2 is a blunder. What they have to play instead? Well, instead they have to play with knight g4. This is how they close the g file. And after g2, knight g2, and rook g1, there will be a possibility of knight e3, which where both knights are protected by each other. So, for example, the game would continue with this, then, well, maybe this move. Knight takes, knight f2, king c4, another check to control the g file, to play this, and then to play rook g4. But there is rook e3, and rook e3 allows to draw the game for white. So we don't sacrifice the rook for that pawn, but we have time to bring our knight to e2. So if they take, it is a blunder because we win a knight. So knight d4, this knight e2, and then we sacrifice the knight, and then most likely it is a draw. But black would have to fight for that draw. If instead rook e7, okay, rook e7, let's say in which position? Instead of doing rook e3, so take this, rook e7, king f6, and then what? This, then it's just g2. And you cannot stop the pawn from promotion, so it's so risky. So knight g4 was very important. Instead, in the game, it was played rook f5 with the same idea to block on g5. So also a logical move, but at the same time, a critical blunder. C4. Well, c4 is a mistake too. Knight a7 just. How does it work? Let's say they deliver a check. So this move is a mistake, because if this move is played, it's well, g2. I want to. Oh no, it's rook e5. King goes back, and then it can be a repetition. So that's why king c1. And these two pawns are stronger than the rook. How? So first of all, this can be played, but bishop g2, this, and in this position, I think we have, well, both options are good. Let's choose this one. Then they go there, and this knight, well, these pieces are pinned, but this knight, the f2 knight is too far from the b pawn, just b6. So knight e4, b7, it's too late. Knight e7 was a more simple way, but white decides to play c4. g2, they sacrifice the bishop. Now rook e7, as Brian suggested, but this time there is no risk that they promote the g pawn because you already sacrificed that bishop. So a5. Well, you can take on a7, but if you take on a7, you let your opponent to bring his pieces to the queen side and stop the pawns with his knight. So his actually task is to sacrifice two knights for three pawns, which is possible. That's why before doing it, let's progress with our pawn moves because we can still stop knight e4. There is a rook. Rook e4. Now knight e4 becomes a threat, but we can play c5. Knight e4 is played, and this is a fork. So what do you think we should do? Yeah, here it's obvious. You don't want to lose on c5. You have to sacrifice there. Now you're rook down, but the pawns are already far advanced. However, you have to play accurately. Well, knight a7 was a possibility, but it's better to play b6 and not take this pawn. You already control the queen square. For example, a takes b6, c takes b6. No rook b4. And then you promote. This knight is too far from the place of action. If, for example, instead of two knights, black had at least one bishop, he could draw the game easily. Rook a8. Knight takes a7. Now you control this queen in square. Knight e3. This is a threat. That's why this move. Knight c4 check, king goes there. Knight tries to stop c6, but you can start with b7. And why b7 is so good? Because your next move can be this, after which you threaten to promote. For example, this knight c8 works well, but c6 is better. And if they come closer with the king, then it's knight c8. King c7 to stop b8, but a7, and now you threaten to promote both pawns that they cannot stop. They can do this, but after a7, after a8 equals queen, it's completely losing position. So king d5 was played. After c7, he resigned. Why? Well, because he cannot control both queen and squares with his pieces. Very nice endgame. But the key idea was to come up with a plan based on your advantages and disadvantages. Here, there is extra pawn, but it's a pawn on that side of the board. So most likely you have to advance these pawns. And you have bishop versus knight. This means that the enemy knights, if they participate on the king side, are too far from the queen side, and you can take advantage of these of the inability of the enemy knight to go to the queen side quickly. So that's why it does make sense to sacrifice your bishop, but instead progress with pawn moves. Yeah, even Vasily Smyslov lost there. Fine, let's continue. Oh, the second, or the third example is the endgame with bishops of opposite color. And usually, one extra pawn in such endgames doesn't guarantee a win. Here, black has two, but these two are doubled, and so in some positions they can be counted as one. Who is Sergei Makarachev, the white player? Well, Sergei Makarachev was a famous grandmaster. He was assisting to Karpov um, in one of the matches against Kasparov. What else? Sergei Kasparov is a grandmaster who has his own YouTube channel in Russian. And among Russian-speaking commentators, in my opinion, he does uh, the most deep analysis. So, well, sometimes when I watch it, I want to sleep. But if I want to see the analysis of a game played recently, I would better watch what he explains regarding this game. Like when, for example, Magnus Carlsen was playing against Fabiano Caruana in London. Well, there was a World Championship match. I was watching his comments. The most popular in Russian chess commentator is Sergei Shipov, which which I don't watch, just occasionally, and I also do not support his point of view, not regarding chess, but regarding other things, especially about politics. So, but Sergei Makarachev doesn't cover any politics. He's mainly focused on chess. That's why his comments, being so deep, are very helpful for any chess player. So, if you speak Russian, I would recommend his channel on YouTube. Well, you can message me and I'll send you the link, or you can just search on internet or on YouTube. Search his channel. So he doesn't have many subscribers. I think about 10,000 only, but he really does a very good analysis. Yuri Averberg was one of the strongest grandmasters of his era. And, he was the oldest grandmaster living in the world, but he died last year, unfortunately. Anyway, so he was also very good with the end games. What do we have? Well, again, our pawns are located on light squares, which is not so good because it means that they are easy targets. So, for example, we cannot move our king further because we're expecting bishop e8, bishop f7, bishop g6 coming. That's why it does make sense to relocate our pawns. So when you play the end game with the bishops of the same color, you usually try to locate your pawns on the squares, uh, on the opposite squares of your bishop. When you play the endgame with bishops of opposite color, then you should locate pawns on the squares of your bishop. Why? Because this is, if you play these moves, then the bishop just simply cannot attack him. Well, how to win? Well, bringing the king to d3 and advancing the pawn to c3 almost guarantee a win. But not everything is so close, so obvious. We have to play g5 to fix this pawn structure and be ready for that. Well, this is not a big issue. How does the c7 pawn help us? Well, it may not help, but if we somehow manage to exchange bishops and lose one of the pawns, the other pawn will distract the king and we will be able to take advantage of it. So, bishop e8. Well, logical move. They want to provoke f6. Bishop g6. The bishop is ready to stop our invasion. So, very logical. And it also stops the c pawn. King d4 anyway. King e2. So, if we decide to play there, then we don't have a chance to progress because, well, how they can continue. Doesn't matter. Even this move is fine, but I think they would play bishop d3, bishop e4, bishop f5, anything. Why? Because let's say this they can just continue with this move. c4, okay, but how does it help? It's a kind of a fortress. You cannot progress. If you decide to go there, they meet you with king e2. That's why you actually have to move to the other side and use this pawn as a distraction. So bishop c1, bishop f5, c4. Why bishop c1 was important? To not let them play in king d2. How to play now? This is where Sergei Makarichev made a very serious mistake, which actually is not so obvious. What do you think he'd better play? So bishop g4, what's the purpose of bishop g4? I don't think it's a good move. Bishop c2. It was important to play g3. Why g3? Because g3 stops king e5, king e4. And this pawn is not so easy target. Here, black would have to continue with h5 and h4, trying to stop it. But at the same time, you should be very accurate with it, because if you play h5 and they play h4, then your h5 becomes a weakness too. So h5, let's say, they play what? They play h4 right away. I don't think it works because you can invade his camp, and then the pawn on h5 is not a weakness because you can achieve pawn to c2. So h5, let's say they just play something like that. You play h4. Now g takes, and even if the king goes there, it's not easy to win. For example, let me play some, let it be bishop g6, king e5. Bishop moves there, so c3. Now king d1. So bishop goes, let's say, to d2 maybe. But they are able to defend both pawns with these moves. So maybe you can go there, king c2, and continue with this move. But if you play so, it's bishop g4. and f5 doesn't make sense. You can start with f5 first in order to play king g3 after that, but just bishop g6 and you cannot progress. And you cannot progress at all because these are the moves that they are going to play. And what can you do? Advance this pawn, move your bishop, but if you just move your bishop, they will repeat these moves. And the king will stay blocking the pawns. So g3 was quite clever and would provide white with drawing chances. Instead, he played king d1, which he seemed is logical because occupying c2 with the king and preventing the this black king activity on the king side was good. Now king e3. Well, almost king e3. You have a bishop hanging. You cannot play like that. Bishop f4 first stops g3. King e2, bishop g3. Bishop g6, you can play c3. Bishop f5 and king e5. Why? Because the king goes there. So bishop c2, king goes there. Bishop b1. How do we need to play in order to progress here? Right, bishop h4. So almost bishop h2, vacating this square for the king. How does it work? So let's say he keeps moving the bishop. Bishop d3. Oh, let me do c5. Let's say bishop back to b1. Bishop g1. Now what? Bishop c2, let's say. This move, this move. Bishop d4. Let's say they just repeat the position. Maybe bishop d3. c4. Well, c4 works, but I don't see the point. So bishop here. It looks like you have to prepare g4. Okay, something similar happened in the game. I'm going to show it. So king f2 was played here, which is logical. Bishop g1. And if king takes, this time it's king e3, king d2, c2, the bishop has to be sacrificed, and this extra pawn guarantees a win. That's why he didn't take. He played king e2, king g3, king f1, bishop f2 first, king c2. Oh, bishop c2, I mean. How would you play for black? Well, of course, you can advance the pawn to c5 or even to c4 if you want, but let's do it later. It would be great if you could bring your king to e3, right? If the king is on e3, it's a winning position. You can just continue with king d2, even you're leaving your bishop on f2. Or if you get your king there, you can play bishop h4 and then king d2. And then you promote. So you mean bishop e1, is it right? Okay, bishop e1, but what if he doesn't take it? H5 and g4. Yes, you are very close, but h5 is not the best way. I even think it's not a winning way, but you are very close. It's something related to the king side. So it's f5. How does f5 work? Let me show you. Well, obviously, if they capture, it's king f4. And after king f2, this endgame is just a simple win. Well, why? Because the king has to go to that pawn, and you have time to invade his camp and capture these pawns. And he cannot go back because there is one more pawn that can be promoted. So if bishop e4, then king a3, and with king a3 you can play king d2 and c2. So of course you will move the bishop, and then you will play king d2. There is nothing he can do to stop it. That's why after the bishop f5 wasn't played on the board, it was bishop b1, f4. So it looks like black trapped his king. But he has an idea. Bishop g6, bishop a3. Oh, maybe bishop a3 is not so important. Bishop c2, h5. Even if the bishop was on g6, h5 still would work, because after bishop takes, black can promote the pawn. So h5 was played, bishop f5. Now c5, just a waiting move, because, well, the king is in a Zugzwang. If the king moves, it's king g2. So if the bishop is on this diagonal, for example, bishop here, it's c2. That's why the bishop has to move somewhere, and this allows us to play g4. But what do we get with g4? If you play g4 right now, then h takes, well, h takes, f takes, king g4, but what did we achieve? So bishop e4, nothing. We cannot progress with that pawn. That's why h4 instead. Bishop f5, fine. How to continue? Well, I myself in this position would continue with c4. Why? Because I don't want the bishop to stay on f5. I want him to move. And then I would initiate the main plan. But actually, if you get a little deeper into details, you don't really need to prepare. You can play g4 right away. How does it work? Well, obviously the bishop cannot take because c2 and you win the game. There can be even a quick checkmate then. So they have to take it. They took with this pawn, but we should analyze both options, this and this moves too. Because if not, if it's something else, if it's bishop e4, then we can win a pawn and then get another passed pawn. So you typically know that if there is one extra pawn in the endgame with bishops of opposite color, it can be a draw. But if there are two distant passed pawns, then it is a win, because one pawn can be stopped with the bishop, the other pawn can be stopped with the king, while the other king can move to any side of the board, and of course he chooses that side where the enemy bishop is located, and then it's an easy win. However, if the pawns are connected, or if that bishop is able to stop both passed pawns simultaneously, for example, if here the c5 pawn was on d4, the bishop would simply stop it. Well, let's say I remove this pawn and put it here, then it is a draw. The bishop can simply stop it. So c2 is always a threat. That's right. So if that's why it was h takes g4, h3, attacking this and threatening to promote, they have to take, and now king f3. What did it allow black to do? Black lost a pawn, right? But created the second passed pawn. And these pawns are too far and can be stopped with the bishop. So g5, king g3, g6, bishop d4 simply. h4, f3, h5, bishop g7. So you cannot take on h4 in this position, because if you do so, they play king g6 and blockade. Well, it's still actually playable. It's still playable, but it's better just to stop with bishop g7. So here, in order to promote, you don't really need to take care about these pawns. Your bishop is fine. It can cover everything. Now what? They have to make a move. Doesn't matter which. They played this move in the game and after f2 resigned. Why? Well, if king f1, it's king f3. How does it work? the king goes there, and the pawn is promoted. If there was no pawn on c5, it would be a draw. Well, let me show you. Bishop d3, king there, bishop f5, king there, king f2, c2, and bishop c2, king c2, and so if not this pawn, it would be a draw. But because of this pawn, it's winning position. These are the next moves. Okay, so when you play the endgame with bishops of the opposite color, your task is to either promote your pawn with the help of the king if it's possible, or if he shoulders you with his king, create an outside on this create the second outside passed pawn. So this game fragment is actually a very good example of the principle of two weaknesses. So here one white's weakness is that black has a passed pawn on the c file that should be stopped, and there is a bishop to take care about it. And the second is the king side. So on the king side, white tries to create another pawn, even at the cost of some sacrifices. Once he does the second weakness, or in our case, it's the second passed pawn, the position becomes winning. However, accurate play by black is required anyway. Okay, so we are done with that example. It's not over. However, before we continue with the last example, I want to remind you that if you like my webinars, which are free, you can donate and support me. So, because doing webinars and preparing for webinars takes time and, of course, resources. For example, I'm working with a FIDE master who does select these games for me, send it, and then I'm doing the analysis for you. So it's very time consuming. So it works easily. If you have PayPal, you just click on this button, enter the amount you want to donate. It's not a recurring donate. It's just, I mean, you send the payment, it's just one payment. So it doesn't charge you every week or every month. It's just one payment. So you enter the amount you want to donate, 10, 15, or 20, then click this yellow PayPal button, enter your PayPal account, and then you can send money automatically to my account. So I can also copy this to the YouTube chat. So I would appreciate this help. It helps me better prepare for the webinars. Okay, let's continue with our last example. So we did 3, there is one more and one left for the homework. So the game example between José Raúl Capablanca and Alexander Alekhine. So actually, can you please tell me how it's better to pronounce? Because, well, Capablanca was originally from Cuba. That's why we should say José Raúl Capablanca. But how do English speakers pronounce his name?
What, Jose Raul Capablanca?
Can you repeat it, please, Brian?
Jose Raul
Jose.
Capablanca.
Jose.
Yeah.
So Jose. Okay.
But
Okay. Fine. Thank
Alekhine
you.
is tougher, right? Or Aliokin or
Well,
Alekhine?
because he was Russian, some people pronounce his family name like Alekhin or Alyokhin, which is more popular. But it is considered that Alekhin is more correct. But because he is Russian and at the same time French grandmaster, you cannot read it like Alekhine, because in French it's also Alekhine. So that's why I am actually I think that ideally you should read names and family names like they sound on the original language. Oh, well, but many would disagree with me, but I think that because the name was given, it was given in that way, that was more traditional to the country where a person was born. Yeah, Alec Hin. Let's say, okay, fine. So look at this position. It's extra pawn, and it's queen and knight versus queen and bishop. Who is better, queen and knight or queen and bishop? So queen and knight is better than queen and bishop. Why? Because queen and knight are able to create more combinations in order to attack the enemy king. And we see that there are squares to occupy with our knights, so which probably create danger for the enemy king, while the bishop cannot do anything because we have pawns on dark squares, they are not weak, and it's almost impossible to attack f2 for black. Our king is on a light square, covering two other light squares, so they cannot attack it. Moreover, we have a queen, which will stay on this diagonal and defend uh, our king. So there is no possible attacks. But we have a pawn majority and on the king side, so we should transform this pawn majority to a passed pawn, as well as combine it with ideas of attacking the enemy king, because these two pieces are better than these two when initiating the attack. Okay, so good point from Alan. Let me read it. A knight is the unique piece, and queen is the most powerful. Queen can do what a bishop can do, but not what a knight can do. So what does it mean? That we can parry the enemy bishop with our queen, but they cannot parry our knight with their queen. Fine, let's continue. So first, obviously, knight e5. Centralizing the knight, bishop g7, attacking it. Check. Well, doing bishop f8 would work, but you also should realize here that if, for example, so we can play queen c6, and this time the exchange of the queens favor white. Why? Because we play on one side of the board, and that's why the knight is not weaker than the bishop. Because we have extra pawn, it should be winning position. So we should take advantage of the enemy king's weakness, create a passed pawn, and, if possible, exchange the queens. That's why they play king h7. How to play now? Let's take advantage of the king's position. If we occupy g5, it is a problem. For example, they play, let's say they play something like, no, this is a terrible move. Let's say they just play something like that. We play knight g5, king h6, h4, and now this becomes a problem because this move attacks f7 and h7 simultaneously. So they would have to play this, which makes the bishop bad, and create a weakness on e6. Well, knight e4, and then somehow we can target this pawn on f6, or just go back to our original plan, play knight c5, attack e6, and try to convert two pawns to a passed pawn. Bishop f6 was played to cover g5, queen e6. There is a threat of d5. That's why king g7 defending the bishop. Queen d3. So preparing for e4, d5, or maybe e4, e5, and then d5. Queen b7, e4 anyway. Queen goes to c6. No rush. d5 is definitely the best move, but Capablanca plays h3. Queen c7. Now d5. So this is a passed pawn. Well, if they don't want this passed pawn to be a protected passed pawn, after d6 and d5, they have to take it. Because if only we play so, we not only put the enemy bishop to passive position, but also create a protected passed pawn, which means that we can use our queen on a different part of the board. Maybe we would move it closer to the king side, so we don't need to defend the pawn on d6 with our queen. That's why it's better for them to take, to make it an isolated passed pawn. And this time they decided to exchange the queens in order to defend their king's position. Well, they could play maybe this move. We would continue with d6, then king f8, and here after d7, this square is covered. It's not so easy to win. Probably we would try to maybe replace our knight, maybe doing some checks on a8. So it is a very tough position, and it's very hard to win because they control d8 and we can hardly attack it. We can only do it from these two squares with our knight. So probably if bishop d8 is played, we have to play queen d5, then bring the knight and do such an attack, but it still may not guarantee a win. However, at this moment, they decided to exchange the queens. And that was a kind of a mistake. However, if they still play properly, it can be a draw. This bishop looks like a very well placed bishop because, well, advancing means that the king can catch it and take, and we can't move the knight. So here, black is very close to a draw, but they have to defend their position accurately. King f1. What else? We cannot progress. We have to bring the king and try to promote the pawn that way. So king f1, king f6, king e2, bishop b4. Knight goes there. Now they let our knight to move. Well, can we move the king? Yes, we can. But then how do we defend this? That's why moving the pawn doesn't allow this, right? Because you can play 96 and allows us to move the pawn first, covering a5, and only then continue with the king moves. So bishop c5, where knight c5, otherwise king e5 is played and the pawn is lost. For example, if we played something like that, it would be this. Our knight is still restricted, and the pawn on d5 is the target. So knight c6, this move is not playable. They play king f5. Well, doing this allows king f4, and we may lose a pawn then. That's why king f3. Well, looks like it is a draw, but we are going to chase the king away and then occupy e4. So king f6, g4. Take, take. What now? Here, black played the logical move, king g5. Why king g5 is a logical move? Because this move doesn't allow us to play this because we lose. However, there is something that black missed. And what do you think they should play instead in order to draw the game? King g7? No, king g7, well, it's not a mistake, but let's say 95. Maybe you cannot play back because of a fork. And if you move the bishop there, I can play with the king and use my f-pawn. Looks like king g7 makes the black's position worse. Probably it can be still a defensive move, but king here, knight e5, and you cannot play king f8. It's still a fork. So let's say you move bishop, let's say a3, and then I can play king e4. You can play there. I can push the pawn. So king e7. Well, I'll try to play something like that, and then d6. Not sure if it is a winning plan, but there are so many forks. Okay, John's suggestion is to play g5 instead. So g5 with a pawn. No, I actually think this is even worse than king g5. Why? Okay, let me play king e2. How do you continue? Let's say you play this move, but then I can play f3 and move my king to that side. So the best way was just to stay and play bishop d6, or maybe bishop d6. Bishop d6 is better because we don't have to calculate, black doesn't have to calculate what happens in case if white advances. King e4, now king g5. How does it work? So f4 cannot be played. f3 can be played, but f3, f5. Take, take. The king has to move back, and then it's just an easy game. If the king goes to e3, then bishop c5, and just bishop back. or king f4. And it's likely to be a draw. Okay, let me show you what I suggest. 95 instead. Why 95? Because if bishop takes, it's an easy win. But f5 still. And now what you have to take? The king goes to d4, but after this move, it is a draw. How is it a draw? Well, black is going to capture this pawn and sacrifice their bishop for the pawn on the d file. Now the knight has to move. Let it be knight f7, bishop b8, further from the knight's attack. This pawn is lost. So king c5, king here, there. Then what? So if the knight can somehow get to c7, then it's possible to blockade, but it's too many moves. Now even this pawn can be promoted faster. Okay, fine. So bishop d6, but instead in the game it was king g5. Well, I told you that if black played accurately, the game could end in a draw, but it's so hard to find these accurate moves when you are down a pawn and this pawn is a passed pawn. Why it doesn't work? Because of these. How to play? Well, in the game it was bishop d4 played, but what's wrong with f5 like we did originally? What do you think? What's wrong with this move? Well, first of all, I should say that this is a blunder. But what's wrong with f5? Ah, it's not a check. Well, yes, it's not a check, but does it really matter whether it's a check or not? Yes, Alan. It is absolutely right. We can win the bishop if we start with this move. We do not still allow king f6. And if they take, we play knight f7 and then win. For example, f takes g4, king g2. Why king g2? If king g3, then this is a pin. King g2. Now, if they take, we win, and they cannot capture our pawn on f2. This becomes winning. If they decide to play something like that, then it still works. d7. This is a threat. So king f6, but now knight c6 and king e7 is impossible. They would have to sacrifice their bishop, and then it's a winning because we kept the f2 pawn alive. So because these weird knight forks that black didn't see, they lost the game. So f5 doesn't work, which they realized, and because of that they played this. But this is a losing move too. Knight f7 check, and there are two extra pawns already. Knight goes there, and well, king e5 is a blunder. If king e5 is played, it's an easy win. This, and then king f4. So you can realize extra pawn, you can capture g6 and promote the g. Bishop b6, taking the knight. Knight c6 doesn't allow the king to come to closer to the pawn. Then, well, we shouldn't blunder it. Well, bishop c5, and king f4 can be played. So even if they take the pawn on f2, we still win. But can we play this move? I think we can. So king g5, knight e5. If the king moves, it's still a fork. They have to play bishop a7, and then we still win with d6. So king e2 would work too. But white realized that they don't really need the pawn on f2, and they played king f4, sacrificing it. Now g5, king f7, and knight e5. How does it work? Well, if the king goes there, the pawn is captured and it's even a check. If the king goes to g7, then after d6, the pawn is promoted. How is it promoted? So bishop b6, let's say, then you can play knight c6, d7, and d8. There is nothing they can do to stop it. King e7 was played, knight g6, and king e4. And this is an easy win. What is our strategy? Move the knight, advance the pawns. So bishop g3, knight f4. Even if they take, we still win, this time because of shouldering. So king here, we move further. Here, we move further. And then once you see that you control the queen square, you should start advancing the g pawn. So king e7, king e5, d6, and g6, and it's game over. Just make sure to not play this and blunder something like that. So first probably play this move, then 93, 95. Oh, bishop b4, it's not the end. King d5, well, if they take, then they cannot stop the pawn. If they play king e8, how would you play? Push the central pawn. Yes, it's d7. You can play d7. How does it work? Well, they have to take it. Or they have to move the king further, but then g7 and the g pawn is promoted. That's it. So let's go back and discuss this position once again. I mean, try to make a conclusion. What do we have here? First of all, we realize what our advantage is, material and positional. Materially, we are a pawn up. Positionally, queen and knight are better than queen and bishop. Our king is safer than the enemy king, and exchanging the queens will favor us too. We may not win if we exchange the queens, but we are closer to win because we play on one side of the board and the knight isn't much weaker than the bishop. Probably it's equal. So that's why we combine the ideas of creating a passed pawn, the ideas of checkmating threats or attacking the king threats, as well as the idea of exchanging the queens. And based on it, you decide which moves to play. Yeah, there is still a lot of tactics in the end game. So this is what I wanted to show you today. Let me send you the homework. Uh, for the homework, I suggest, yes, for the homework, I suggest these two positions that are likely, yeah, that are going to appear here. So how would you play for white in this position? How white can progress? They have advantage. In the first one, it's well, the pawn on h5 is hanging, of course, but it's two minor pieces versus rook, and because black doesn't have a passed pawn, two minor pieces should be better. And the second question is whether knight c7 is a possible move or it's not, and the game ends in a draw after knight c7. Okay, fine. So that's all for today, and we are going to continue next Sunday. I'm going to check your homework and also start our next topic. I have some ideas of what I'm going to cover. So if you have any questions, you're welcome. Again, if you want to donate, use that PayPal link that I sent to you. Okay, thanks, Alan. But it would be better if you send your answer by email. Also, for those of you who don't know, we have a we have group classes on Mondays and Fridays. Okay, let me share the screen once again. So it's called Master Chess Tactics and Strategy. These are group classes for chess players from 12 to 1500. Well, even if you are a little above or a little below, it still works. We did the half of the course. So if you want to join, you still can, but then you would have to watch the recordings of the previous classes. And every lesson we cover a different topic. Well, tactics, a different tactical motive that I'm explaining, and I'm providing you homework to work on this tactical motive. And we also do positional play. For example, at our previous lesson, we were talking about how to attack on the queen side. When the king is on the king side, how to attack weaknesses on the queen side. So this is pure positional play. And so I think that this group lessons help to improve a lot. Also, at the webinar, we have some students who participate in this event. So you can also share your opinion regarding the course, whether it's helpful in your opinion or not. Well, in my opinion, it's probably the best and the most affordable because, well, it's just $79 per month. Well, if you don't want to join now, maybe you'll decide to join when I announce the second course of group classes. However, probably it will be for a different level, for not for 12 to 1500 rated players, but for the beginners. Oh, okay. So unfortunately for Michael, his schedule doesn't allow him to participate in these group lessons in live. That's why he watches the recordings. And I hope that Michael is doing the homework, but I'm really glad that Michael is enjoying these classes anyway. Okay, fine. So we are done for today. Thank you for coming and hope to see everyone next Sunday.